dreadful always yesterday well. Yesterday standing on the right side, today not standing on the left side. What kind of person is this? It's not satisfied with this side, move to that side because of getting conversation. Just looking for conversation. No different from a two-headed bird. The right arm inside like to complain, continuously complain too much. People who praise our sweet words, they are slaves to conversation. They are like two-headed birds, seeing it like this all the time, seen all along, doing all the time. Receive conversation from the lowly people. One day truth will be revealed that day. Probably won't dare to look up, being branded as a two-headed bird, doing bad things like cited before. Train full convict, yesterday belly. Yesterday standing on the right side, today not standing on the left side. What kind of person is this? Not satisfied with this side, move to that side because I'm getting conversation. Just looking for conversation. No different from a two-headed bird. The right arm inside like to complain, continuously complain too much. People who praise our sweet words, they are slaves to compensation. They are like two-headed birds, seeing it like this all the time, seen all along, do it all the time. Receive conversation from the lowly people. One day truth will be revealed that day. Probably won't dare to look up, being branded as a two-headed bird, doing bad things like cited before. Yesterday standing on the right side, today not standing on the left side. What kind of person is this? But not satisfied with this side, move to that side because I'm getting conversation. Just looking for conversation. No different from a two-headed bird. The right on your side like to complain, continuously complain too much. People who praise our sweet words, they are slaves to compensation. They are like two-headed birds, seeing it like this all the time, seen all along, doing all the time. Receive conversation from lowly people. One day truth will be revealed that day. Probably won't dare to look up, being branded as a two-headed bird, doing bad things like cited before.